Welcome, dear listeners. Today I'm here with a story that will take away all your fatigue. Tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I love making friends from far away. If you like the videos, you can subscribe and like them. This motivates me. Now, relax. The story begins. Chapter 1. An ordinary morning. But none of these sounds were enough to catch the attention of the man sitting in the armchair in front of the fireplace. Sherlock Holmes had just folded the morning newspaper in his hand for the third time. His eyes scanned the pages, searching for something beyond the ordinary news. An interesting crime, an unusual event, any puzzle to occupy his mind. But London in recent days had been disappointingly quiet for a detective. "Watson," said Holmes, placing the paper on the side table, "where has people's creativity in committing crimes gone?" Dr. John Watson sat at the breakfast table, nibbling on his buttered toast. He was used to his friend's grumpy mornings by now. When Holmes's mind was idle, the whole house suffered. "Perhaps it's a good thing, Holmes," Watson said calmly. "A drop in crime is a blessing for society." Holmes grumbled. "For society, perhaps. But for me, Watson, for me, it's torture. The mind must work like a machine. When it stops, it rusts." Just then the doorbell rang from downstairs. Holmes's ears pricked up. Footsteps echoed on the stairs, heavy, determined, familiar footsteps. "Lestrade," said Holmes before turning his eyes to the door. "And from the urgency, it's clear this is no ordinary courtesy call." Watson looked at his friend in surprise. "How did you—" The door opened and behind Mrs. Hudson appeared Scotland Yard's senior inspector, Lestrade. The man's face bore none of its usual self-assurance. Instead, a slight unease, perhaps even embarrassment, was visible. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," said Lestrade, removing his hat. "I apologize for disturbing you at this early hour." Holmes waved his hand. "Sit down, Inspector. Coffee or tea?" "Thank you, neither." Lestrade sank into the chair opposite Holmes. His hands were clasped on his knees. "Actually, I came to consult you about something. Unofficially, you understand." Watson left his breakfast and joined them. Holmes, however, kept his eyes fixed on Lestrade. The wet patches on the man's coat suggested he had been out in the open early this morning, while the rust mark on the toe of his left shoe indicated he had been walking on a metal-heavy surface. "An industrial facility," Holmes said thoughtfully. "Could it be a tram depot?" Lestrade's eyes widened. "Good heavens, Holmes, how did you—" "The colour and texture of the rust mark on your shoe are characteristic of railroad or tram tracks. The soot stains on your coat indicate you were near a coal-fired system. The Blackfriars Tram Depot in South London fits that description perfectly. What's more, I saw a brief report in this morning's paper about an accident there." Holmes smiled slightly. "Go on, Inspector. What brought you here?" Lestrade took a deep breath. "You're right. The tram depot. Yesterday morning, a worker was found dead after his shift. His name was Liam Parker, 34 years old, an electrical systems technician. The body was lying in the service corridor at the back of the depot building." "Cause of death?" asked Watson, his doctor's instincts kicking in immediately. "According to the official report, sudden collapse resulting in a fall and head trauma," said Lestrade. But the hesitation in his voice betrayed a suspicion lurking behind the words. The man was lying on his back, with a small wound at the back of his head. Apparently, he hit the metal shelf behind him. Holmes furrowed his brow. "On his back, you said?" "Yes." "Interesting. Holmes brought his fingers together under his chin. When a person faints and falls, they usually collapse forward or to the side. The knees buckle, the body folds. Falling on one's back, that is, falling completely backward, is quite rare. It implies a sudden shock, the kind of shock that prevents the body's protective reflexes from kicking in. Watson nodded. Electrocution, he said thoughtfully. A high-voltage current could cause exactly that kind of reaction. The muscles contract suddenly, and the person is thrown backward. Lestrade looked sceptical. Doctor, our police doctor examined the body. He found no evidence of electrical burns. Electrical injuries aren't always visible, Watson explained. Especially with low ampere but high voltage currents, the marks on the skin can be very small, tiny puncture-like lesions on the fingertips or palms. An untrained eye could easily miss them. Holmes stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the fog was slowly lifting, and the rooftops of London were emerging indistinctly. "Tell me more about Parker," said Holmes, speaking with his back turned. "What kind of man was he?" Lestrade pulled a small notebook from his pocket. Single. Lived alone, a small flat near Lambeth. Known to be competent at his job, described by friends as honest but distant. However, some changes have been noticed in recent weeks. What kind of changes? Insomnia, distraction, restlessness. Lestrade looked at his notes. One of his co-workers, a young apprentice named Tommy Brennan, said Parker had his head elsewhere in recent days. Another mentioned seeing him alone in the warehouse late at night on several occasions. Holmes turned. In his eyes was that sparkle Watson knew so well, the look of a hunter who had caught the scent of a puzzle. "So the man may have discovered something," Holmes said slowly. "Something that disturbed him, something that robbed him of his sleep. And perhaps this discovery is connected to his death." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. "Holmes, I must be honest with you. Scotland Yard is about to close this case. The warehouse manager, Victor Harlow, insists it was a simple accident. The union isn't contesting the accident designation because it guarantees the family compensation. No one wants a murder investigation." "But you do," said Holmes. "Otherwise you wouldn't be here." Lestrade was silent for a moment. Then he slowly shook his head. "I have a feeling, Mr. Holmes. There's something odd about this man's death. Maybe it's just experience talking, but something doesn't feel right. The way the body was lying, the man's behavior in the last few days. I don't know. Maybe I'm imagining things." Holmes looked at Lestrade intently. Over the years, they had worked on countless cases together. Lestrade had always been a by-the-book police officer whose methods were sometimes inadequate, but whose instincts were usually correct. His suspicion was something to be taken seriously. "Describe the corridor, where the body was found," said Holmes. Lestrade closed his eyes, trying to recall the scene from that morning. A narrow corridor, about 2 meters wide, maybe 15 meters long. Brick walls, concrete floor. On the left, electrical panels and some maintenance equipment. On the right side, there was a metal door leading to the storage room. Parker was lying a few meters beyond that door, near the middle of the corridor. Was the door open or closed? It was closed. Lighting. There are a few light bulbs on the ceiling, but only one was working that morning. The corridor was quite dim. Holmes nodded. What else was in the corridor? Any objects, tools, anything that had fallen? Lestrade thought. There were a few work overalls hanging on a hook on the wall. On the floor near the body, there was a flashlight, apparently dropped by the man as he fell. And Lestrade paused. And there was an old clock on the wall, a wooden-framed mechanical wall clock. Was the clock working? Yes, it was, but the cleaner said something. What did she say? Lestrade shuffled through his notes. Ah, yes. Maggie Chen, the cleaner. She said the clock was running a little fast. She thought it was strange, because that clock has always shown the same minute for years. Holmes's eyes lit up. How many minutes fast? I don't remember exactly. 4 or 5 minutes, I think. That could be important, said Holmes, more to himself than to Lestrade. Very important. Watson looked at his friend curiously. The importance of the clock wasn't clear to him yet, but there must be a reason Holmes was fixated on this detail. There's one more thing, said Lestrade, as if he had saved the most important information for last. A note was found in Parker's pocket. Handwritten. A short note. Holmes's attention was completely focused on Lestrade. What did it say? Friday meeting with Mr. Harlow. Unacceptable, it said, in capital letters in angry handwriting. Harlow, the warehouse manager, right? Yes. Victor Harlow, 52 years old, has worked in that warehouse for 15 years. He's been in a managerial position for the last 5. Holmes began pacing thoughtfully around the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the floor, his mind already wandering through the dim corridors of the warehouse. This note, at first glance, makes Harlow a strong suspect, he said finally. However, my experience has taught me that the most obvious clues are often misleading. Real killers don't leave such obvious traces behind. So, you think Harlow is innocent? Asked Watson. I'm not thinking anything yet, Watson. I'm just observing, and my observations tell me that many questions remain unanswered in this case. Holmes paused and turned to Lestrade. Inspector, can you keep this case officially open, at least for a few days? Lestrade hesitated. My superiors are putting pressure on me, Holmes. But I can buy you a few days. However, I must tell you this. If we don't find concrete evidence, the case will be closed as an accident. A few days will suffice, said Holmes. Watson, take your coat. We're going to the tram depot. Watson immediately stood up. Holmes's interest in this case had energized him too. It had been a long time since they had been involved in such an exciting investigation. Lestrade also stood up. Would you like me to come with you? Holmes shook his head. Not yet, Inspector. I prefer to conduct the initial investigation alone. An official police presence might unsettle witnesses. However, I will need a copy of the autopsy report and, if possible, photographs taken at the scene. You'll have it by tomorrow morning, said Lestrade. He put on his hat and headed for the door. He paused in the doorway and turned back. Holmes, if this man really was murdered, who could have done it? And why? Holmes took his pipe from the mantelpiece. Those, Lestrade, are the questions I must answer. And I promise you, if there is a murder behind Liam Parker's death, we will find the killer. Lestrade nodded and left. As his footsteps faded on the stairs, Holmes looked out the window. The fog had almost completely lifted, and the sun's rays cast a pale light on London's dirty streets. "What do you think, Holmes?" asked Watson, grabbing his coat and hat. Holmes paused for a moment before lighting his pipe. "I'm thinking, Watson, that a tram depot is an extremely interesting place to commit murder. High-voltage electrical systems, heavy machinery, dangerous chemicals. Countless opportunities to fake an accident. So, you're sure it was murder?" Holmes shook his head. Not yet. But a man falling backwards, being restless and sleepless in his final days, an angry note found in his pocket, and a wall clock that's gone further ahead than usual. All of this can't be coincidence, Watson. It can't. He lit his pipe, took a deep breath, and slowly exhaled the smoke. His eyes held a determined expression. "Let's go," he said finally. "Liam Parker is waiting to tell us his story. And the dead, Watson, if you listen carefully, are the best witnesses." When the door closed behind them, the silence of 221B Baker Street returned. The fire crackled in the fireplace, the clock ticked, and London continued on its course of another ordinary day. But by the end of this day, it would become clear that nothing was as it seemed, because sometimes the most ordinary mornings held the darkest secrets. Chapter 2. Iron and Spark. The Blackfriars tram depot rose above a bend in the Thames River in South London. The massive brick building was a typical example of Victorian industrial architecture. High arched windows, soot-black walls, and the smell of oil and metal wafting through the air. The smoke rising from the depot's chimneys merged with the gloomy sky, casting a constant grey veil over the area. When Holmes and Watson stepped down from the carriage, they saw several tram cars in the large courtyard in front of the warehouse. Workers were labouring beneath the cars, the sounds of metal and shouts echoing through the air. Yet beneath this ordinary bustle, a tension was palpable. Whispers, furtive glances, and sudden silences. "The news of the death has spread," said Holmes, surveying the scene. "Look at the expressions on people's faces, Watson. It's not fear, it's unease. They're talking among themselves, but they fall silent when we approach. This could mean someone knows something." Watson nodded. "Or it could just be the natural shock following a tragic event." "Perhaps," said Holmes. "But I don't believe in coincidences." They walked towards the main door of the warehouse. At the entrance, a broad-shouldered man with a red moustache was waiting. He wore the dark blue jacket typical of warehouse managers, and his name tag read V. Harlow. "Mr. Holmes, I presume," said the man, extending his hand. His voice was controlled, but there was an underlying tension. "I'm Victor Harlow, the warehouse manager. Scotland Yard informed us of your arrival." Holmes shook the man's hand. Harlow's palm was sweaty and warm. His heartbeat was above normal. However, this could be a sign of guilt, or it could simply be stress. "Thank you for seeing us, Mr. Harlow," said Holmes. "We'd like to see the scene." A brief hesitation flashed across Harlow's face. Of course. But I must tell you, it was a terrible accident. Liam. Parker was a good man, a skilled technician. But lately, he seemed tired. Everyone noticed." "Did you notice it too?" asked Holmes. "Yes, I did." Harlow began to lead them into the warehouse. "In fact, I spoke to him about it last week. He was working overtime, perhaps too much. I suggested he take some time off, but, workers want to earn money." Watson glanced quickly at Holmes. The contents of the note Liam had pulled from his pocket came to mind. "Friday conversation with Mr. Harlow. Unacceptable." There was a discrepancy between the friendly suggestion Harlow described and the angry tone of the note. The interior of the depot was even more impressive than the exterior. The high-ceilinged main hall was a huge workshop where tram cars were maintained and repaired. Metal rails were embedded in the floor, chains and lifting mechanisms hung from the ceilings. There was the smell of oil, metal dust, and sweat everywhere. Liam was involved with the electrical systems, Harlow explained, directing them toward a side corridor. Most of the trams are still horse-drawn, but the city is transitioning to an electric system. Liam was a key part of that transformation. He was a real expert on electricity. Holmes was carefully examining his surroundings. The electrical cables on the walls, the panel boxes, and the fuse systems did not escape his notice. It was a complex infrastructure, even for a modern warehouse. Countless opportunities for an expert, countless tools for a killer. Finally, they reached a narrow corridor. Harlow stopped and pointed to the end of the corridor. "This is where we found him," he said, his voice slightly hoarse. Holmes stepped forward. The corridor was even narrower than Lestrade had described. It was difficult for two people to walk side by side. On the left wall, electrical panels covered in dust were lined up. On the right wall was a heavy metal door leading into the warehouse. The floor was bare. Concrete and oil stains were visible in some places. Holmes took his magnifying glass out of his pocket and crouched down. Watson stood behind him, notebook at the ready. "Where exactly was the body?" Holmes asked. Harlow took a few steps forward and pointed to a spot on the floor. "Here." He was lying on his back, his head near the bottom of that metal shelf. Holmes walked over to that spot. He couldn't see any marks on the concrete, no blood, paint, or anything else. But there had to be a reason for that. "Was the place cleaned?" he asked. No, Harlow said quickly. "The police forbade us to clean. They just removed the body. Nothing else was touched." Holmes shook his head and turned his attention to the metal door. It was a typical industrial door, heavy, with a steel frame and spring-loaded hinges. The door handle was a horizontal metal bar, the kind that opens when pressed. Holmes began examining the door handle with his magnifying glass. Watson noticed the change in his friend's expression. His brow was furrowed, his eyes narrowed. "Interesting," Holmes murmured. "What did you find?" Watson asked. Holmes extended his finger toward a spot on the door handle. "Here, on the upper part of the handle, there's a very slight colour change. Do you see it? The metal has taken on a slightly darker, almost bluish tone compared to the surrounding areas." Watson moved closer and looked. He could only make out the spot Holmes was pointing to with careful examination. "What does this mean?" "This colour change indicates that the metal was exposed to high heat," said Holmes. "And in an industrial setting, that kind of heat is usually produced in one of two ways, either by open flame or by an electric arc." Harlow's face paled. "What do you mean?" Holmes stood up and turned to the manager. "Mr. Harlow, was this door handle electrically charged?" "What? No, of course not." Harlow's voice rose. "This is a maintenance depot, a dangerous place, but we have safety measures. The door handles are grounded. They shouldn't carry electricity at all." Holmes walked silently toward the electrical panels. He stopped in front of them and examined one of the metal covers. The lock on the cover was in the open position. "This panel should be locked, shouldn't it?" Holmes asked. Harlow approached and frowned when he saw the panel. "Yes, it should normally be locked, but—" He thought for a moment. "Last week, Ryan Marsh, one of our electricians, was doing maintenance on this panel. Maybe he forgot to put the lock back on." "Ryan Marsh," said Holmes, committing the name to memory. "I'd like to meet him." Of course. He should be working today." Holmes looked at the panel once more and then turned his attention to the wall at the end of the corridor. There, hanging on the wall, was the old wall clock Lestrade had mentioned. A mechanical clock with a wooden frame and a yellowed, round face. Its hands were still turning. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Holmes approached the clock and examined the face. It read 11:30. "Watson, look at your pocket watch," said Holmes. Watson took his watch from his pocket. 11:26. "So this clock is 4 minutes fast," said Holmes thoughtfully. Lestrade was right. Harlow shrugged. "That clock has been here for years. No one adjusts it. It usually runs a few minutes slow. Maybe someone wound it." "Who could have wound it?" "I don't know. Maybe the janitor. Maybe a worker. No one pays attention to that clock." Holmes continued to examine the clock. On the edge of the dial there was a small keyhole used to adjust the hands. In old mechanical clocks like this, a special key was needed to move the hands. "A key is needed to wind this clock," said Holmes. Who might have such a key? Harlow thought. Technicians usually carry various tools. Such a key could be found in any toolbox. Holmes put down the watch and turned to Watson. "I need to see the autopsy photos. Lestrade said he would send them tomorrow morning, but we can't wait. Watson, go to Scotland Yard and get the photos immediately. I'll continue the examination here." Watson nodded. "I'll go right away. Be careful, Holmes." After Watson left, Holmes was alone in the corridor. Harlow had returned to the main hall. He had to be at his post. Holmes made good use of this solitude. He took out his magnifying glass and began examining the corridor inch by inch. He searched the floor, the walls, everywhere for clues. He tried to imagine Liam Parker's final moments. Why had the man come to this corridor? What was he looking for? And what had happened when he touched that door handle? He paced the distance between the electrical panel and the door. About 4 meters. A cable could easily bridge that distance. If a fuse in the panel had been bypassed, a cable connected to the door handle could, a key, have carried high voltage. Holmes approached the panel and examined its interior. Fuses, cables, connection points. Everything looked normal. But one thing caught his attention. One of the cables inside the panel looked newer than the others. Its insulation was brighter, its copper cleaner. "Someone has tampered with this panel," Holmes muttered, and then tried to cover their tracks, but not completely. A few hours later, Watson returned with an envelope in his hand. He found Holmes waiting outside the warehouse in the courtyard. The detective was sitting on a bench, puffing on his pipe and deep in thought. "I got the photos," said Watson, handing over the envelope. Dr. Ward, the police doctor, wasn't very cooperative, but he had to give them to me on Lestrade's orders. Holmes opened the envelope and took out the photos. There were 3. One showing the general view of the body, one a close-up of the face, and one of the hands. In the first photo, Liam Parker was lying on his back. His eyes were closed, his face showing not pain but bewilderment. Death had come suddenly. The man hadn't even understood what was happening. Holmes moved on to the second photograph. The face belonged to a man in his mid-30s. Hard lines, short hair, a few days' stubble. The face of an ordinary working man. The third photograph showed his hands. Holmes took out his magnifying glass and examined them carefully. And then he saw it. "Watson, look," he said excitedly. "Look at the fingertips of his right hand. Do you see? Tiny, dot-like marks. On the index finger and middle finger." Watson leaned in and looked. Indeed, there were tiny, reddish dots on the fingertips. Someone without medical training could easily have overlooked them. "Electrical entry points," Watson said gravely. "This proves the man didn't have a heart attack. He was electrocuted." And with his right hand, Holmes added. He held the door handle with his right hand. The current entered through his fingertips, passed through his body, and probably exited through his feet. The concrete floor wasn't conductive, but the man's shoes could have been wet, or there could have been a wet spot on the floor. Watson shook his head in horror. This isn't an accident, Holmes. This is premeditated murder. Yes, said Holmes, putting the photographs back in the envelope. And a rather cleverly planned murder. The killer is someone who knows electrical systems, familiar with the inner workings of the warehouse, and someone who knew Liam Parker would be in that corridor that morning. Watson thought for a moment. The note found in Liam's pocket, the argument with Harlow. Holmes shook his head. That note could be there to mislead us, or it could be completely irrelevant. I'm not ruling Harlow out as a suspect yet, but we need to focus our attention on someone else. Who? Ryan Marsh, the electrician, the man who forgot the panel lock. I need to talk to him. Just then, a man emerged from the warehouse door. He was in his early 30s of medium height, with curly brown hair and an outgoing expression. He was wearing overalls and holding leather gloves. "Mr. Holmes," said the man, approaching with a smile. "I'm Ryan Marsh. Mr. Harlow said you wanted to talk to me." Holmes stood up and studied the man carefully. At first glance, Ryan Marsh seemed utterly ordinary. His sincere smile, relaxed manner, and friendly tone made him immediately likable. But Holmes had learned to look beneath the surface. "Mr. Marsh," said Holmes, extending his hand. "Pleased to meet you. I have a few questions about Liam Parker's death." Ryan's smile faded for a moment. Of course. It's terrible. Liam was a good friend. I still can't believe it." "How long had you been working together?" "About 3 years. We worked the same shift most of the time. He dealt with the electrical systems. I looked after the mechanical parts. But we helped each other out from time to time." Holmes looked at Ryan's gloves. Dark brown leather, the kind used for work. But wearing gloves in this weather didn't make much sense. November was cold, but not freezing. "Your gloves," said Holmes, nodding toward them. "Aren't they a bit thick for this weather?" Ryan looked at his gloves and shrugged. "Habit. My hands get cold easily. Plus, they protect me when I'm working with electricity." "Of course." Holmes said nothing else but kept his eyes on the gloves. "How has Liam been lately?" asked Watson. Ryan thought for a moment. "To be honest, he seemed a bit different, distracted, tired. He was constantly writing in that notebook. When I asked, he brushed it off. 'Personal notes,' he said." "Did you ever see what he wrote in his notebook?" "No, he never showed it to us, but—" Ryan hesitated as if unsure whether to say something. "Once, I saw him looking at the inventory lists, the records of materials in the warehouse. I don't know why he was looking at them." Holmes and Watson looked at each other. Inventory lists. This could be important. "Mr. Marsh, where were you on the morning of the incident?" Holmes asked. "Here in the warehouse, but I was in the main hall having breakfast in the canteen, actually. I wasn't the first to find Liam's body. Derek, the night watchman, found it." "What time was that?" "I don't remember exactly. It must have been around 7:30. Shift change time." Holmes nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Marsh. I'll probably have more questions." Ryan smiled again. "I'm always happy to help, Mr. Holmes. I want to know what happened to Liam. He was a good man. He didn't deserve to die like that." Ryan turned and went back into the warehouse. Holmes watched the man's retreating figure thoughtfully. "What are you thinking?" Watson asked quietly. Holmes lit his pipe again. "I'm thinking, Watson, that Mr. Ryan Marsh is a very sincere man. Perhaps too sincere. Do you suspect him?" "I find everyone suspicious, Watson, until proven otherwise." Holmes exhaled smoke and looked into the distance. "But for now, we need to find Liam Parker's notebook, and we need to look at the inventory records. We need to understand what Liam discovered in his final days." Watson nodded. "Shall we start tomorrow?" "No," said Holmes, standing up. "Today. The killer may be using every second to cover their tracks, and we, Watson, must stay one step ahead of them." As the sun dipped behind London's rooftops, Holmes and Watson left the Blackfriars tram depot. Behind them, the enormous building remained in shadow. And somewhere within those shadows, a killer lurked. But he wouldn't be able to hide for long, because Sherlock Holmes was on his trail. And once Holmes had found his prey, he never let it escape. Chapter 3. The Silence of the Witnesses. The next morning, the door of 221B Baker Street was knocked on early. Holmes, as usual, had woken before dawn. Thoughts about the tram depot had occupied his mind throughout the night. Watson, meanwhile, was starting his day at the breakfast table with eggs and bacon, prepared by Mrs. Hudson. Mrs. Hudson opened the door and returned with an envelope in her hand, and a familiar figure behind her. "Inspector Lestrade, gentlemen," said the landlady, stepping aside. Lestrade looked official as always, but the circles under his eyes revealed that he, too, had had a sleepless night. "I apologize for disturbing you so early in the morning," said Lestrade, handing the envelope to Holmes. A complete copy of the autopsy report and additional photographs taken at the scene. Also, a list of Liam Parker's personal belongings. Holmes eagerly took the envelope and spread its contents on the table. Watson left his breakfast and joined them. "There's one more thing," said Lestrade, pulling a small, leather-bound notebook from his pocket. Parker's notebook. It was found in his flat, under his bed. It was initially considered insignificant and not included in the inventory, but I had it looked at again last night. Holmes's eyes lit up. He took the notebook and began flipping through the pages. Neat, orderly handwriting filled the pages. Dates, notes, numbers, and some indecipherable abbreviations. "Excellent," said Holmes. "This is exactly what I was looking for." Lestrade twirled his hat in his hand. "Holmes, I must be honest with you. My superiors want this case closed today. I've only bought you a few more hours. If we don't find something concrete—" "We will," Holmes said sharply. "I'm going back to the warehouse today. I need to talk to witnesses, especially those looking for details that may have been overlooked in the initial interviews." Lestrade nodded. "Is there anything I can do to help?" "Yes. Can you get me access to Victor Harlow's financial records? Unofficially, of course. And I want the depot's inventory reports for the last 2 years." Lestrade raised his eyebrows but asked no questions. He had learned to trust Holmes's methods. "I'll see what I can do." After the inspector left, Holmes and Watson set off for the tram depot. This time Holmes had Liam Parker's notebook with him, and the detective's mind was occupied with the clues on its pages. "What's in the notebook?" Watson asked from inside the carriage. Holmes showed him a few pages. Mostly work notes, technical drawings, electrical diagrams, maintenance dates. But the notes from the last 2 weeks are different. Watson looked closely. On one of the pages was a table, material codes on one side, numbers on the other. Question marks had been placed next to some of the lines. "What are these?" "Inventory records," said Holmes. Liam kept track of the warehouse's material, stock, and apparently he found some discrepancies. Look, this line says 150 miot copper cable, scrap, but next to it he's written not present. Watson frowned. Recorded as scrap, but actually missing. Exactly. And this isn't the only example. Here, here, and here. Holmes flipped through a few more pages. Over the past 2 years, dozens of materials have been recorded as scrap or defective. Copper cable, electric motors, spare parts, all missing. Theft, Watson said, understanding. Systematic theft, Holmes corrected. Someone is regularly stealing materials from the warehouse and manipulating the records. Liam discovered this, and that discovery probably led to his death. When they arrived at the tram depot, the morning shift had already begun. Workers were busy between the cars, the air filled with the sounds of metal and engines. But Holmes's main interest was the witnesses. The first stop was cleaning Lady Maggie Chen. Maggie was a 29-year-old woman, slender and with attentive eyes. Holmes found her in a small break room at the back of the depot. She was standing next to one of the tables, holding a broom. "Miss Chen," said Holmes, approaching her in a gentle voice. "I'm Sherlock Holmes. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Liam Parker's death." Fear flashed in Maggie's eyes for a moment, but she quickly regained control. "Of course, sir, but I don't know much. I just do the cleaning." "Sometimes those who see the most are the ones no one pays attention to," said Holmes with a soft smile. "Can you tell me about the morning of the incident?" Maggie took a deep breath. "I came in early, as usual. I usually start at 6. I sweep the corridors, collect the trash. I was doing the same that morning." "Did you go to the service corridor?" "Yes, I did, but before the body was found. It must have been around 6:30. Everything was normal. Well, except for one thing." Holmes leaned forward. "What?" Maggie hesitated. "It might sound silly, but the clock on the wall. I pass that corridor every day and look at the clock. It's been there for years, always the same. It's usually a minute or two slow, but that morning..." "What happened that morning?" "It was fast, about 4 minutes fast. That had never happened before. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it. Then when the body was found, it didn't even occur to me to mention it." Holmes's eyes lit up. "That's very important, Miss Chen. Very important." "Really?" The woman looked surprised. "It's just a clock." "Sometimes the most insignificant-looking things reveal the biggest secrets." Holmes stood up. "One last question. Did you notice anything else in the hallway that morning? Any person? Any sound? Any smell?" Maggie thought. "Actually, there was an electrical smell. You know, that burnt smell when fuses blow? It was very faint, but I noticed it. I thought someone was working on one of the panels." Holmes nodded. "Thank you, Miss Chen. You've been very helpful." As they left the break room, Watson asked excitedly, "What does the clock clue mean?" Holmes was thinking as he walked. "Someone deliberately set the clock forward, Watson. 4 minutes. Why would someone do that? For an alibi? Exactly. If you're planning a murder and need to prove you were somewhere else at a specific time, manipulating the time is a logical strategy. By setting the clock forward, the killer may have wanted to make it seem like they were somewhere else at the time of the incident." Watson frowned. "But can we prove it?" "Not yet, but the pieces are starting to come together." The next stop was the office of warehouse manager Victor Harlow. The office was a small glass-partitioned room on a platform above the main hall. From here, the entire warehouse was visible. Harlow was sitting behind his desk. When Holmes and Watson entered, the expression on the man's face was far from welcoming. "Again, Mr. Holmes," said Harlow, a definite edge to his voice. "Didn't we talk enough yesterday?" "I have a few more questions, Mr. Harlow." Holmes sat down uninvited in the chair opposite him. "About the conversation you had with Liam Parker on Friday." Harlow's face tightened. That conversation was a personal matter. The note found in Parker's pocket said, "Unacceptable," in capital letters. That doesn't sound like a friendly chat. Harlow took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair. For a moment, he looked much older than his years. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll tell you the truth. Liam was asking for overtime. He wanted extra shifts, including weekends. I refused." "Why?" "Budget constraints. The company wants us to cut costs. Overtime pay is expensive." I explained this to Liam, but he wouldn't accept it. We argued. What he called unacceptable was the refusal of his overtime request. Holmes was studying Harlow carefully. The man's eyes were not evasive, but the tremor in his hands showed that he was afraid of something deep down. "Mr. Harlow," Holmes said slowly, "are the safety measures in the warehouse adequate?" Harlow's face paled. "What do you mean?" "Electrical panels, grounding systems, safety locks. Is everything up to standard?" There was a moment of silence. Harlow's lips trembled. "Look," he finally said, his voice lowering. "This building is old. The electrical system needs some updating. I've written reports to the company many times, but they won't allocate the budget. I'm doing what I can, but so there are security gaps." Harlow bowed his head. "Yes, and if this comes out, the responsibility will fall on me. My career, my reputation, everything." Watson looked at Holmes. Harlow's guilt was obvious, but was it murder guilt or negligence guilt? Holmes stood up. "Mr. Harlow, don't worry. I'm not concerned with security negligence, but let me tell you this. If you know something, now is the time to say it." Harlow shook his head. "I don't know anything, Mr. Holmes. I just want this case closed as soon as possible." As they left the office, Watson spoke thoughtfully. "Do you think Harlow is guilty?" Holmes shook his head. "Harlow is guilty, yes, but not of murder, of negligence. He ignored the security breaches and now fears they'll be exposed. That's why he's nervous and defensive. But I don't think he killed Liam." "So that note was a red herring?" "It appears so. The killer may have left that note behind deliberately or by accident. Either way, it led us to Harlow. But the real question is, what was Liam's real discovery and who wanted to prevent it from coming to light?" To find the answer, they needed their next witness, Union Representative Nina Kovac. They found Nina in a small shed outside the warehouse. She was 38 years old with sharp eyes and a determined expression. Files, petitions, and union documents were piled on her desk. "Mr. Holmes," Nina said, standing up and extending her hand. A firm, confident handshake. "I heard you were coming. You have questions about Liam." Holmes nodded. "Did you know him well?" A shadow of pain crossed Nina's face. "Yes, I knew him. He was a good man, honest, hard-working. He couldn't stand injustice." "Did he share anything with you recently?" Nina hesitated for a moment. Then she took a deep breath and spoke. "Liam was going to say something at the union meeting this weekend. He told me about it beforehand. He said it was important business. He didn't give any details, but he seemed serious." "Any idea what it might have been about?" Nina shrugged. Liam usually focused on workplace safety issues. Maybe it was something about security breaches or... She paused. Or... Nina looked away. Or something else. Liam had been acting strangely the last few weeks. He was always wandering around the warehouse, looking at inventory lists, taking notes. I asked him once. He said, "I'm checking things," and didn't say anything else. Holmes took out a notebook and showed it to Nina. "These are the notes." Nina examined the pages. Her eyes widened. "Yes, these are inventory codes. Was Liam looking into the stock records?" "It appears so, and he found some discrepancies." Nina's face hardened. "Theft? Is material being stolen from the warehouse?" "I'm working on that possibility." Holmes took the notebook back. "Mr. Kovacs, who do you think could do such a thing?" Nina thought. "I don't know. Everyone who works here is trustworthy. At least I thought so. But if there really is systematic theft, it must be someone on the inside. Someone with access to the records, someone who knows the system." Holmes nodded. "One last question. Did Liam mention how he got along with Ryan Marsh?" Nina looked surprised. "Ryan. They were friends. They worked the same shift, ate together. Liam never said anything negative about Ryan. Why do you ask?" "Just curious," said Holmes, his expression unchanged. By the time they returned to the warehouse, it was almost evening. Holmes also wanted to speak with the night watchman, Derek Sully, but the man wouldn't be coming in until the night shift. "We must return tomorrow night," Holmes said to Watson. "Derek can tell us what he saw on the night of the incident." Watson nodded. "What do you think we learned today?" Holmes paused and looked thoughtfully at the warehouse. The enormous building was shrouded in shadows in the evening light. "We learned that Liam Parker discovered a theft scheme in the warehouse. He planned to expose it at the union meeting, and someone killed him to stop that." "Ryan Marsh?" Holmes didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed in the distance. "Ryan Marsh is an electrician. He has access to the panels. He could have closely monitored Liam's movements, and today I noticed he didn't take off his gloves. Not even once." Watson frowned. "Gloves?" "Yes, Watson. It's normal to wear gloves in this cold, but not taking them off indoors, even in a warm environment. That stems either from habit or from hiding something." What could he be hiding? Holmes turned and looked at Watson. There was a dark gleam in his eyes. "The marks on his hands, Watson. When you hold a high-voltage cable, burn marks remain on the palm and fingers. Small, hard-to-notice marks, but marks that wouldn't escape a doctor's eye." Watson's eyes widened. "So Ryan's hands? Perhaps. I'm not sure yet, but I will be soon." As the carriage made its way toward Baker Street, Holmes was lost in thought. The case was becoming more complex, yet it was also becoming clearer. The pieces were coming together, slowly but surely. Liam Parker's killer was close. Holmes could feel it. And the killer must have sensed Holmes closing in. That made him dangerous. A cornered animal was the most dangerous kind. But Sherlock Holmes was not one to shy away from danger. On the contrary, danger sharpened him. And this case would go all the way. Chapter 4. Paper Trails. The sitting room at 221B Baker Street had been transformed into a detective's laboratory that night. The table was covered with pages torn from Liam Parker's notebook, inventory lists, and Holmes's own notes. The fire crackled in the fireplace, and gas lamps cast a yellow light. Holmes was examining the pages of the notebook with his magnifying glass. Watson sat in the armchair opposite, watching his friend work. It was well past midnight. but neither of them was thinking of sleep. "Liam Parker was a methodical man," said Holmes, without taking his eyes off the notebook. "Look, Watson, every page is dated, every note is organized. The electrical diagrams are drawn with engineering precision. This man took his work seriously." Watson stood up and came over to Holmes. He looked at the open page of the notebook. On the left was a technical drawing, a diagram of an electrical panel. On the right were dates and notes. "What do these notes mean?" asked Watson, pointing to some abbreviations. Holmes turned the page. "These are inventory codes. BK150 means 150 meters of copper cable. EM25 means a 25-watt electric motor." Liam kept track of the warehouse's material stock. "Why would he do something like that on his own?" "Because he suspected something." Holmes turned to another page. "Look, here, a note from 3 weeks ago. Scrapyard to be checked." And a question mark next to it. Watson examined the page. Liam's handwriting was neat and legible. Did he check the scrapyard? He did, and what he found bothered him. Holmes turned a few more pages and stopped. "Here it is, from 2 weeks ago. BK150X12. Scrap recorded. Not on site. Where did it go?" Watson frowned. 12 rolls of copper cable recorded as scrap, but physically not present? Exactly, and this isn't the only example. Holmes placed the notebook on the table and stood up. He began pacing. In front of the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back. "Liam has been systematically comparing inventory records with actual stock over the last 2 weeks, and he's found dozens of discrepancies." Holmes returned to the table and pulled a list from among the scattered papers. "The official inventory reports Lestrade brought. I compared them with Liam's notes." Watson looked at the list. Holmes had marked some lines in red ink. "These marked lines correspond to the items Liam questioned," Holmes explained. "The total value of materials recorded as scrap or defective over the last 2 years exceeds £3,000 approximately." Watson whistled. "That's a small fortune." "Yes, and someone has pocketed that fortune." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "The question is, who?" "It must be someone with access to the records," Watson said thoughtfully. "The manager? Harlow?" Holmes shook his head. "Harlow has access, but no motive. The man already earns a good salary and is too cowardly to risk his career. Besides, as we saw today, his real fear is security breaches coming to light. If he were stealing, he wouldn't be so defensive. He'd be trying to cover it up." "Then who?" Before Holmes answered, he turned to the last pages of the notebook. "Liam seems to have found his suspect. Look, here, a note written 2 days before his death." Watson leaned in to look. There were only a few words on the page, but their meaning was clear. "RM, morning shifts. Always early, panel access, check." "RM," Watson said slowly. "Ryan Marsh." Holmes nodded. Liam suspected Ryan, and he was looking for evidence to prove it. But he was killed before he found any evidence. Or he found evidence, and that's why he was killed. Holmes took his pipe from the mantelpiece. "Think, Watson. Liam discovers Ryan is stealing. Maybe he's lying in wait, watching Ryan. And Ryan realizes Liam is following him." Watson shook his head in horror. "And decides to silence him." "Exactly." Holmes paused for a moment before lighting his pipe. "But there are still missing pieces. We need to know exactly what Ryan was doing on the morning of the incident and where the stolen materials went. Could they have been sold on the black market? Most likely. Copper cable and electrical equipment are in high demand at this time. New buildings, railway expansions, tram lines. Someone could easily turn these materials into cash. Holmes lit his pipe and blew smoke. His eyes were distant, his thoughts swirling in his mind. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "we go back to the warehouse. This time I'll examine the entry and exit logs. Who entered the warehouse when? And who left when? Especially on the morning of the incident." Watson looked at his watch. It was approaching 2 in the morning. "We should get some sleep now, Holmes. Tomorrow will be a long day." Holmes grumbled but didn't object. Watson was right. A tired mind couldn't be sharp, and this case demanded the sharpest mind possible. The next morning, when Holmes and Watson arrived at the tram depot, the weather was overcast and cold. The November wind carried a damp breeze from the Thames. In the depot courtyard, the usual crowd of workers was absent. It was Sunday, and only the duty crew was working. Holmes headed straight for the depot office. At the door, a man he didn't recognize was waiting, in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered with a stern gaze. "You must be Mr. Holmes," the man said without extending his hand. "I'm Derek Sully, the night watchman. Inspector Lestrade asked me to speak with you." Holmes nodded. "Mr. Sully, I was expecting you. Shall we go inside?" Derek led them into a small guardhouse. Inside was a desk, a few chairs, and a key rack hanging on the wall. In one corner, a cupboard held the logbooks. "What do you remember about the night of the incident?" Holmes asked, sitting down opposite him. Derek took a deep breath. "That night was normal, at least at first. My night shift starts at 10 and ends at 6 in the morning. I patrol the warehouse at regular intervals, checking the doors." "Did anything catch your attention that night?" Derek thought for a moment. "Actually, yes. Around midnight I saw a light in the main hall. No one should have been there at that hour. I went to check it out." Holmes leaned forward. "What did you see?" "It was Ryan Marsh. He was working in front of one of the electrical panels. I asked him what he was doing. He said, 'Emergency maintenance.' There had been a malfunction before the morning shift, and it needed to be fixed overnight." Watson and Holmes looked at each other. This was important information. "At midnight?" asked Watson. "Isn't that unusual?" Derek shrugged. "Ryan sometimes works late. He's ambitious, wants to get ahead. I didn't ask too many questions." Holmes stood up and approached the key panel. "Which doors do these keys open?" "Various sections of the warehouse. The main hall, the service corridor, the scrap yard, the offices." "Which one is the scrap yard key?" Derek pointed to a bronze-coloured key on the board. "This one." Holmes took the key and examined it. "Who can use this key?" "Theoretically, only managers and senior technicians, but—" Derek hesitated. "The key hangs here. I check it at night, but during the day, anyone can access it." Holmes hung the key back up and turned to Derek. "On the morning of the incident, you were the first to find the body, right?" Derek's face darkened. "Yes. When my shift ended at 6 in the morning, I did my usual final round. When I entered the service corridor, there he was, Liam. He was lying on his back, eyes open." "Did you notice anything else? Any sounds, smells, movements?" Derek thought. "No sounds, but there was, smell. A faint, burnt-like smell. The kind you get when fuses blow." Holmes nodded. This matched what Maggie Chen had said. "Thank you, Mr. Sully. One last question. Can I see the entry and exit logs?" Derek went to the cabinet and pulled out a thick notebook. "Here. Everyone who enters and exits is recorded, along with the time." Holmes took the notebook and began flipping through the pages. Watson came over and they examined it together. The records for the day of the incident, the morning Liam died, were clear and concise. 0513, Ryan Marsh, entry 0547, Maggie Chen, entry 00, Derek Sully, exit, end of shift. 06.15, Tommy Brennan, entry 6.22, Liam Parker, entry 06.51, Victor Harlow, entry 06:45, body found, note by Derek Sully. Holmes placed his finger on the first line. Ryan Marsh entered the warehouse at 5:13 a.m. That's an hour before his normal shift. Watson frowned. Why would he come in so early? That's the question. Holmes turned the page and looked at the previous day's records. Ryan's name was among the earliest arrivals almost every day. Mr. Sully, said Holmes. Did Ryan always come in this early? Derek nodded. Yes, he was usually the first to arrive. I told you he was a hard worker, but... He paused. But? In recent months, he started coming even earlier, and sometimes I saw him here after midnight, like last night. Holmes put the notebook down on the table. The pieces were coming together in his mind, slowly but surely. Watson, he said, we need to see the scrapyard. Derek showed them the way to the scrapyard. It was a small building at the back, separate from the main building. The door was locked with a heavy padlock. Holmes unlocked it with the key he got from Derek. The door creaked open, and the smell of mould and rust wafted out. The scrapyard was a place true to its name. Broken pieces, old equipment, and piles of rusty metal were everywhere. But what Holmes was looking for were things that should have been here, but weren't. According to Liam's notes, said Holmes, pulling a copy of the notebook from his pocket, there should be 12 rolls of copper cable, 8 electric motors, and various spare parts here, all recorded as scrap. Watson looked around. I don't see any copper cable. Neither do I. Holmes examined the shelves one by one. No motors either, none of them. They spent half an hour in the warehouse. Holmes checked every corner, every shelf. The result was clear. Most of the materials listed as scrap in the records were not physically present. This is systematic theft, Holmes said finally. Someone is recording working materials as scrap and then taking them out. Probably during the night shift, when no one is watching. Ryan, said Watson. We know he was here late at night. Holmes nodded. Yes, and Liam discovered this. The notes in his notebook point to Ryan. But, he paused. But, we still don't have definitive proof. Concrete evidence proving that Ryan committed theft and killed Liam. Holmes narrowed his eyes. The gloves. I need to see Ryan's gloves. When they returned to the warehouse, Ryan Marsh was working in the main hall. He was under a tram car, fiddling with electrical cables. He was wearing his usual work overalls and those leather gloves again. Holmes approached. Mr. Marsh. Ryan looked up and smiled. Mr. Holmes, more questions? Just a few small things. Holmes crouched down next to Ryan. What time did you arrive at the warehouse that morning? Around 5. I like to get up early, get my work done before anyone else arrives. What were you doing there so early? Ryan shrugged. Maintenance. This car's electrical system was acting up. I wanted to check it before the morning shift. Holmes nodded, as if satisfied with that answer, but his eyes were fixed on Ryan's gloves. Your gloves, said Holmes, nodding toward them. Leather, right? They look high quality. Ryan looked at his gloves. Yes, old but sturdy. They protect me when I'm working with electricity. Of course. Would you mind taking them off for a moment? I'd like to see your hands. There was a moment of silence. Ryan's smile froze. For a second, something flashed in his eyes. Fear, anger, it was unclear. My hands, Ryan said, his voice slightly tense. Why? Just curious. Holmes said, his tone unchanged. An electrician's hands reveal a lot about his work. Ryan hesitated for a moment. Then he smiled, but it seemed forced. Sure, why not? Slowly, he removed his left glove. His hand looked normal, calloused, a worker's hand. Then he started to remove his right glove, and stopped. Actually, said Ryan, putting his glove back on, I have work to do now. Maybe another time. Holmes's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Ryan stood up and walked away quickly. Watson came over to Holmes. What happened? Holmes stood up and looked in the direction Ryan had gone. He didn't take off his right glove. He couldn't, because there's something he wants to hide there. Burn marks. Yes, marks made while holding a high-voltage cable. A determined look appeared on Holmes's face. We're almost certain now, Watson. Ryan Marsh killed Liam Parker. But we can't prove it. Not yet. Holmes turned and looked at the warehouse. But we will. We just need the last few pieces. That evening, when they returned to Baker Street, Holmes stood in front of the fireplace, deep in thought for a long time. Watson knew the state of his friend well. He was trying to put the final pieces together. Harlow, Holmes said finally, breaking the silence. Watson looked up. Harlow? We cleared him as a suspect. Not a suspect, but a witness. Holmes stood up. Harlow admitted to arguing with Liam, the refusal of overtime. That explains the note in Liam's pocket. Yes, we know that. But think about it, Watson. Why would Liam want overtime? The man was already tired and sleep-deprived. Why would he want to work more? Watson thought. He needed the money? Holmes shook his head. Liam was in good financial standing. Lestrade's list of personal effects included a bank passbook, a man with regular savings. Then why? Holmes narrowed his eyes. Because he wanted to be in the warehouse on the night shift, to watch Ryan, to document the theft. Watson's eyes widened. Liam wanted to catch Ryan red-handed? Exactly, and when Harlow refused the request, Liam must have looked for another way. Maybe that morning he decided to come in before his regular shift to watch Ryan. Holmes lit his pipe and blew smoke. And Ryan noticed. He realized Liam was following him. That morning, when Liam entered the warehouse, the trap was already set. Watson nodded. It all made sense. What do we do now? Holmes leaned against the mantelpiece and stared into the fire. The flames danced across his face. Now, he said slowly, we find the missing pieces. I need to see the prints on Ryan's gloves, and I need to find out where the stolen materials went. How? A faint smile appeared on Holmes's lips. We'll corner Ryan, Watson, and a cornered man makes mistakes. Outside, the London night had fallen. Street lamps cast a faint glow in the misty air, and somewhere in the shadows of the tram depot, a killer was drifting into a restless sleep. But his sleep would not last long, because Sherlock Holmes was closer to the truth than ever before. And the truth, sooner or later, would come to light. Chapter 5. The Glove and the Shadow. On Monday morning, London awoke to its usual grey tones. The fog drifted like a thin veil over the streets, the wheels of horse-drawn carriages making a slippery sound on the wet cobblestones. At 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes had risen before dawn and was reviewing his plans one last time. When Watson came downstairs, he found Holmes at his desk. A map of London was spread out before him, with various points marked on it. "Good morning, Holmes," said Watson, sitting down at the breakfast table. "Did you sleep at all?" "A few hours," said Holmes without taking his eyes off the map. But my mind wouldn't rest. We're very close, Watson. Very close. Watson looked at the points his friend had marked. A tram depot, a few streets, and an area along the Thames were marked. What are these? Possible sales points, said Holmes. The stolen copper cable and electrical equipment must have gone somewhere. There are a few places that buy this kind of material on the black market. We'll check them out today. Just then there was a knock at the door and Mrs. Hudson entered. She was holding an envelope. "This arrived this morning, Mr. Holmes," she said, handing him the envelope. It looked urgent. Holmes took the envelope and opened it. Inside was a short note in Lestrade's handwriting. "Holmes, there's been a significant development. A black marketeer was caught near the warehouse. The man confessed to regularly receiving copper cable from someone. He didn't name names, but gave a description. I'll be waiting at Scotland Yard this afternoon. Lestrade." A smile appeared on Holmes's face. Perfect timing. Watson read the note. A black marketeer. This could directly implicate Ryan. Perhaps, but first, we need to pay another visit to the warehouse. Holmes stood up and took his coat. I must see Ryan's gloves. And one more thing. I need to understand how the clock on the wall was. Advanced. The clock? Are you still preoccupied with that? Holmes turned to Watson as he put on his coat. That clock, Watson, is at the heart of this case. Someone deliberately advanced it by 4 minutes. This cannot be a coincidence. Someone manipulating time wants to create an alibi. When they arrived at the tram depot, the morning shift was in full swing. The air was filled with the sounds of metal, engine noise, and workers shouting. Holmes headed first for the depot office. Victor Harlow was sitting at his desk, busy with paperwork. When he saw Holmes, a weary expression appeared on his face. "Again, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice now conveying not anger, but only weariness. "What do you want this time?" "Just a few small things, Mr. Harlow." Holmes sat down across from him. "I want information about the wall clock in the service corridor. How long has that clock been there?" Harlow looked surprised. "The clock? I don't know. It's been there for years. It was there even when I started. Has it ever been repaired? Serviced?" "No, not that I know of. It's an old clock. Nobody cares. Sometimes it runs slow. Sometimes it stops. Then someone winds it up and it keeps going." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Does that clock require a special key to wind the hands forward?" Harlow shrugged. "I don't know. Most old mechanical clocks have such a key, but for ours, I've never looked. Who keeps keys like that in the warehouse?" "Technicians usually carry all kinds of tools, especially the senior ones. Their toolkits are full." Holmes stood up. "Thank you, Mr. Harlow. One last thing. Could I see Ryan Marsh's toolkit?" Harlow's eyes widened. "Ryan's? Why?" "Just curious." Holmes's tone implied no further questions. Harlow hesitated, but then nodded. "Toolboxes are usually left in the locker room. Ryan's on shift now, so his box should be there." The locker room was a small section off the side of the warehouse. Wooden lockers lined the walls, and various personal items sat on the benches in the middle. Holmes found Ryan Marsh's locker. It had a small name tag on it. "Watson, wait by the door," Holmes said quietly. "Let me know if anyone comes." Watson nodded and stood guard by the door. Holmes opened the locker. Inside was a work uniform, a few personal items, and a large leather tool bag. Holmes took out the bag and opened it. Inside were various tools: screwdrivers, pliers, wire cutters, electrical tape, and one more thing. In the side pocket of the case lay a small, bronze-coloured key. Holmes took it out and examined it. Its tip was shaped to fit into a toothed mechanism. It was exactly like the winding keys of old mechanical watches. "I've found it," Holmes murmured. Just then, Watson coughed. Someone was coming. Holmes quickly put the key back in his pocket, replaced the bag, and closed the cabinet. Entering through the door was Ryan Marsh himself. Ryan paused when he saw Holmes. Momentary flicker of unease crossed his eyes, but he quickly recovered. "Mr. Holmes," he said with a forced smile. "What are you doing here?" Holmes turned with a calm expression. "Mr. Marsh, I was actually looking for you. I have a few more questions." Ryan's eyes drifted to the cabinet and then back to Holmes. "Of course, but I'm a bit busy right now. Shall we talk during the break?" The break would be fine. As Holmes passed Ryan, he looked at the man's hands. The gloves were still there. "Mr. Marsh, why don't you ever take your gloves off?" A brief tension flashed across Ryan's face. "I told you, my hands get cold. It's a habit." "Of course." Holmes left the room without saying anything else, and Watson followed him. Outside, Watson asked curiously, "What did you find?" Holmes took the small key out of his pocket and showed it. "A watch key in Ryan's bag." Watson's eyes widened. "Does this prove he set the clock forward?" "Not on its own. Many technicians might have similar keys, but combined with other clues, it forms a pattern." Holmes put the key back in his pocket. "Now we need to find a clock repairman. We must learn exactly how that clock works." Before noon, Holmes and Watson arrived at a small watchmaker's shop in an old part of London. Dozens of watches were displayed in the shop window, and from inside, the ticking sounds rose like a symphony. The shop owner was an elderly, thin man. The eyes behind his glasses reflected years of experience. "Mr. Holmes," said the man, recognizing the customer. "Inspector Lestrade from Scotland Yard mentioned you. How can I help you?" Holmes described the clock in the service corridor. An old mechanical wall clock with a wooden frame and a round dial. "Ah, yes," said the repairman thoughtfully. "These types of clocks were very popular about 40 years ago. They were often used in industrial facilities. What is needed to move the hands of this clock? Forward?" The repairman pulled a similar clock from under the counter. "Look, there are two ways with these types of clocks. First, you can use the winding mechanism on the back, but that stops the clock and you have to reset it. Second." The man pointed to a small hole on the side of the clock. "You insert a special key into this hole and move the hands directly. That way the clock keeps running and only the time displayed changes." Holmes took the key he had found in Ryan's bag out of his pocket. "Will this key work?" The repairman took the key and examined it. Then he inserted it into the hole on the side of the watch. The key fit perfectly. "A perfect fit," said the repairman. "This key was designed specifically for this type of watch." Holmes and Watson exchanged glances. Another piece had fallen into place. "One last question," said Holmes. "How common is this type of key?" The repairman shrugged. "It used to be common, but they don't make watches like this anymore. Finding a key like this, either from an old collector or from a well-equipped technician's toolbox." When they arrived at Scotland Yard, Lestrade was waiting for them. There was a rare excitement on the inspector's face. "Holmes, Watson, come," said Lestrade, directing them towards an interrogation room. "You'll want to see the man." In the interrogation room, a man in his mid-30s with a sly look sat across the table. His clothes were worn and dirty, and he had a few days' stubble on his face. "This is Georgie Tate," said Lestrade. A black marketeer. He was caught on the banks of the Thames selling stolen goods. Holmes sat down opposite the man. Mr. Tate, I'm Sherlock Holmes. I have a few questions. Georgie shifted nervously. I want a lawyer. A lawyer will be called, said Lestrade. But if you cooperate, things might be easier for you. Holmes leaned forward. Mr. Tate, you admitted to regularly receiving copper, wire and electrical equipment from someone. Who was this person? Georgie bit his lip. I didn't give a name. You don't need to give a name, just describe him. There was a moment of silence. Then Georgie began to speak, his voice low and reluctant. A man in his 30s, curly brown hair, medium height. He always wore leather gloves. I never saw his hands. Holmes and Watson looked at each other. The description matched Ryan Marsh perfectly. Where did you meet this man? On the banks of the Thames at an old pier. He would come at night, usually after midnight. He would bring the materials in a wheelbarrow. How often? Once or twice a month, for about 2 years. Holmes nodded. Everything fit. Ryan being seen late at night in the warehouse. The missing materials from the scrap yard. 2 years of systematic theft. When was your last meeting? Georgie thought. 2 weeks ago, but he said there was a problem. Let's take a break for a while, he said. He seemed nervous. 2 weeks ago, right around the time Liam started discovering the thefts. Holmes stood up. Thank you, Mr. Tate. You've been very helpful. As they left the interrogation room, Lestrade asked excitedly, Is that enough? Can we arrest Ryan Marsh? Holmes shook his head. Not yet. Georgie's description fits, but it's not a definitive diagnosis, and we need to prove the connection between the theft and the murder. What shall we do then? Holmes looked out the window thoughtfully. We'll corner Ryan, but first, I need one last piece. That evening they returned to the tram depot. This time, Holmes wasn't looking for Ryan directly. Instead, he wanted to talk to the apprentice technician, Tommy Brennan. They found Tommy in the main hall. The young man, 26 years old, was enthusiastic and talkative. It was clear he admired Liam Parker. His eyes moistened when he was mentioned. Mr. Holmes, said Tommy, shaking his hand. I heard you were going to ask about Liam. I'll tell you everything. Liam was a good man. He taught me a lot. Holmes spoke gently. Do you remember Liam's last days? Did you notice any changes? Tommy thought. Yes, he had changed. He seemed distracted, tired, but at the same time determined, like he was after something. How was his relationship with Ryan Marsh? Good, I guess. At least that's how it seemed to me, but... Tommy hesitated. But on the morning of the incident, something felt strange. After the body was found, everyone was in shock. But Ryan... Tommy frowned, trying to remember. What did Ryan do? Ryan acted like he knew before anyone else. He said, something must have happened to Liam. But no one had mentioned death yet. Derek had only said, Liam is lying in the hallway. Call for help. Ryan was the first to say the word death. Holmes's eyes lit up. Are you sure? Tommy nodded. Yes, I remember because it surprised me. He said something like, poor Liam, he shouldn't have died like this. I still thought he was just unconscious. Watson looked at Holmes. This was important. Ryan knew Liam was dead before the death was officially announced. This was either suspicious foresight or the knowledge of an accomplice. Holmes thanked Tommy and they left. As they exited the warehouse, Watson spoke excitedly. That was like a confession, Holmes. Ryan gave himself away. A psychological slip, Holmes said thoughtfully. Criminals often make such mistakes. They reveal what they know at a time they shouldn't. This is a strong sign of Ryan's guilt. Do we have enough evidence now? Holmes paused and looked at the warehouse. In the evening light, the massive building was shrouded in shadows. Almost, he said. But I need one last thing, the inside of Ryan's gloves. Without seeing those burn marks, we can't make a murder charge. But the man refuses to take off his gloves. A slight smile appeared on Holmes's lips. Then, Watson, we'll create a situation where he has to. Watson raised his eyebrows. What are you planning? Holmes didn't answer immediately. His eyes were fixed on the distance, a plan forming in his mind. Tomorrow, he said finally, we'll invite Ryan Marsh to Baker Street, and there we'll learn the truth. As the carriage made its way to Baker Street, Holmes gazed silently out the window. London nights, as always, looked foggy and mysterious. Street lamps cast pale light, shadows dancing at every corner. Watson studied his friend's face. In Holmes's eyes there was a glint that suggested the case was nearing its end, but there was also a sense of determination. Holmes, Watson said finally. Ryan is a dangerous man. He's already killed someone. Holmes turned his head and looked at Watson. I know, Watson. That's why we must be careful. But fear must not stand in the way of justice. I'm so worried about you. Holmes smiled slightly. Don't worry, my friend. I'm a careful man. And tomorrow we'll show the world Ryan Marsh's true face. As the car approached Baker Street, Holmes looked out to the window again. The lights of London flickered in the distance, and somewhere, in the shadows of this city, a murderer was spending his last night. Perhaps he didn't know it yet, but he would find out very soon, because Sherlock Holmes never gave up on the truth. And the truth was now too close to be hidden. Chapter 6. The Source of the Spark. That night, the sitting room at 221B Baker Street had turned into a crime lab. Spread out on the table were the tram depot's electrical diagrams, notes taken from Liam Parker's notebook, entry and exit logs, and Holmes's own drawings. The fire crackled in the fireplace, bathing the room in an orange glow. Holmes stood at the head of the table, drawing something on a small blackboard with the chalk in his hand. Watson sat in the armchair by the fireplace, watching his friend work. It was well past midnight, but neither of them was thinking of sleep. Watson, Holmes said finally, putting down the chalk. I understand everything now. All the pieces have fallen into place. Watson sat up excitedly. Tell me, Holmes, from beginning to end. Holmes turned and pointed to the blackboard. On it was a simple diagram of an electrical circuit, a power source, wires, a switch, and a grounding symbol. It all starts with electricity, said Holmes. Ryan Marsh knows the electrical systems in the depot like the back of his hand. He's been working there for years, knows every panel, every wire, every connection point by heart. Watson nodded. Go on. Holmes touched the drawing on the board with his finger. The tram depot's electrical system operates at high voltage. The tram motors require a powerful current. This current is distributed from the main panels and controlled by various protective mechanisms. Fuses and grounding. Exactly. Normally, metal surfaces are grounded. That is, even if an electric current reaches them, it is safely conducted to the ground and does no harm, but... Holmes paused and narrowed his eyes. What happens if someone cuts the grounding wire? Watson thought. The metal surface becomes electrified. Exactly. And if that metal surface is, say, a door handle, the person touching it gets electrocuted. Holmes walked over to the table and picked up a sketch of the service corridor. "Look, Watson, there's an electrical panel in the service corridor. This panel powers the corridor lighting and some equipment. Normally, the metal door handle isn't connected to this panel. It has its own separate grounding line." But Ryan changed that. Yes. On the night of the incident, Ryan came to the warehouse after midnight. Derek Sully saw him. He was supposedly doing emergency maintenance, but in reality, Ryan was setting a trap that night. Holmes added another drawing to the board. A cable running from the panel to the door handle. Ryan ran a hidden cable from the panel to the door handle. This cable was thin and easily concealable. It ran along the wall from the corner of the ceiling in a way that no one would notice. Then he cut the door handle's grounding wire. Now the door handle was a trap, carrying high voltage. Watson shook his head in horror. But that could have killed anyone who touched the door. "No," said Holmes, "because Ryan added a switch to the circuit. A specific fuse on the panel is normally in the off position. When he flips that fuse, the current reaches the door handle. When he flips it back, everything is normal. So Ryan could activate the trap exactly when he wanted. Exactly. And that's where the wall clock comes in." Holmes took the entry-exit logs from the table to explain the clock's importance. According to the records, Ryan entered the warehouse at 5:10 in the morning. That's an hour before the regular shift. At that hour, there's almost no one in the warehouse, only the night watchman Derek, but he's on patrol, not always in the same place. Ryan used that time to set the trap. Yes, but the really clever part is his alibi. Holmes pointed to the clock. Ryan claims he was in the cafeteria at the time of the incident. In the cafeteria, having breakfast with the other workers around 6:45 a.m. Derek found the body at 6:45 a.m. So Ryan's alibi matches the time the body was found. Watson frowned. But how is that possible? If Ryan was in the cafeteria, how could he electrify the door handle? Holmes's eyes lit up. That's the reason for the clock manipulation, Watson. Ryan set the wall clock 4 minutes ahead. That changed the time everyone perceived. Watson was trying to understand. Could you explain? Holmes drew a timeline on the board. This is how it actually happened. Ryan activated the trap at 6:30 a.m. He tripped the fuse on the panel. He wasn't in the cafeteria at the time. He was near the hallway. Liam Parker entered the warehouse at 6:30:02 and headed straight for the service corridor. Ryan knew Liam would come to that corridor because Liam had been constantly in that area lately, doing inventory checks. Holmes placed markers on the line. At 6:30:05, Liam touched the door handle and was electrocuted. His heart stopped, and he fell backward. Death was instantaneous. And then Ryan moved quickly. He turned off the fuse on the panel, disarming the trap. He disconnected the hidden wire between the door handle and the panel. He only had a few minutes to do all this. Holmes moved forward on the timeline. At around 6:40, Ryan appears in the cafeteria. He has breakfast with the other workers. And this is where the clock comes into play. Because the clock on the wall is 4 minutes fast, everyone sees it as 6:45. But the real time is 6:41. Watson blinked. So Ryan created a 4-minute buffer. Exactly. Derek Sully said he found the body at 6:45. But he actually looked at the clock on the wall and saw 6:45. The real time was 6:41. That 4-minute difference gave Ryan enough time to set the trap, wait for Liam to die, clean up the evidence, and show up in the cafeteria. Watson shook his head, both in amazement and horror. That's an incredible plan. Yes, clever, but not perfect. Holmes put down the board and turned back to the table. Ryan made a few mistakes. First, the color change on the door handle. When high current passes through, the metal heats up slightly and changes color. It's impossible to completely erase that trace. We saw that at the scene. Second, the burn marks on Liam's fingertips. The coroner missed them, but a careful examination reveals the points of electrical entry. Holmes took Liam's notebook. Third, Liam's notes. Liam suspected Ryan and wrote it down. RM, morning shifts, always early, panel access. This note points directly to Ryan. Fourth, Holmes smiled. Fourth psychological slip. Tommy Brennan told us Ryan mentioned Liam was dead before the death was officially announced. That's either extraordinary foresight or the killer's knowledge. Watson stood up and paced the room a few steps. And the gloves. Ryan never took off his gloves. Yes, that could be the most critical piece of evidence. Holmes narrowed his eyes. Ryan worked with high-voltage cable while setting the trap. No matter how careful he was, minor accidents can happen when dealing with electricity. He would have had burn marks on his palms or fingers. That's why he never took off his gloves. Watson paused and turned to Holmes. This is all very compelling, Holmes, but do we have definitive evidence that would convince a jury? Holmes was silent for a moment. This was the weakest point of the case. We have the following, said Holmes, counting on his fingers. First, the clock key in Ryan's bag. It could have been used to set the clock forward. Second, the entry-exit logs. They show Ryan arrived unusually early. Third, Georgie Tate's statement, confirming he took stolen goods from someone matching Ryan's description. Fourth, Liam's notes, linking Ryan to the theft. Fifth, Tommy's testimony, suggesting Ryan knew about the death beforehand. But none of these prove conclusively that Ryan killed Liam, said Watson. They're all circumstantial. True. Holmes walked to the fireplace and stared into the flames. That's why we need Ryan's confession, or at least we need to see the marks under his gloves. Watson frowned. Ryan won't voluntarily take off his gloves. We've already seen that. Then, said Holmes, turning, we'll create a situation where he has to. Watson asked curiously, "What are you planning?" Holmes took his pipe from the mantelpiece, but didn't light it. Holding it in his hand, he spoke thoughtfully. "I'll invite Ryan to Baker Street, under the pretext of technical consultation. I'll say I have questions about the electrical system in the warehouse. The man will come. Refusing would arouse suspicion. And then? Then I'll tell him everything I know, piece by piece, step by step. The theft scheme, Liam's discovery, the murder plan, the clock manipulation, everything, and looking him straight in the eye. I'll see the truth." Watson looked worried. "This could be dangerous, Holmes. The man has already killed someone." "Don't worry, Watson. Lestrade and a few police officers will be waiting outside, and you'll be right here with me." Holmes smiled slightly. "Besides, Ryan won't try to kill us here. He's too smart for that. He might try to escape, but not to kill." Watson still didn't look convinced, but he didn't argue. He had learned to trust Holmes's plans. "Well, what about the gloves?" Watson asked. "How will you force Ryan to take off his gloves?" A sly gleam appeared in Holmes's eyes. "A simple trick, Watson. People can't control their reflexes. If I drop something in Ryan's hand, something hot, for example, he'll reflexively want to take off his gloves." Watson raised his eyebrows. "Hot tea? Perhaps, or a spark from the fireplace, or something accidentally spilled." Holmes shrugged. "I'll improvise, depending on the situation. But I'll see his hands, Watson. You can be sure of that. As the night wore on, Holmes explained the details of the plan to Watson. Every possibility, every scenario had been considered. A message was sent to Lestrade. He was requested to be at Baker Street tomorrow afternoon. As 3 o'clock approached, Watson finally went to bed. But Holmes remained in his chair in front of the fireplace, his eyes fixed on the fire, his mind replaying tomorrow's encounter. Ryan Marsh was a clever man. The way he planned the murder, his efforts to cover his tracks, his alibi. All of it showed intelligence beyond that of an ordinary criminal. But intelligence alone was not enough. Ambition, fear, and guilt pushed even the most intelligent people to make mistakes. And Ryan had made that mistake. In fact, he had made several mistakes. Now, Holmes was going to throw those mistakes back in his face. The fire in the fireplace was slowly dying down. The corners of the room were plunged into darkness, leaving only the red glow of the embers. Holmes felt comfortable in this darkness. Darkness was the best environment for thinking. He thought of Liam Parker, a man he didn't know but now knew very well. An honest, hard-working man who believed in justice. When he saw an injustice, he didn't remain silent. He took action. And that courage had led to his death. But Liam's death would not be in vain. Holmes had promised that. The killer would be brought to justice. And Liam's spirit would find peace. Outside, the London night had grown quiet. Street lamps cast faint light in the foggy air. Somewhere a dog barked and then fell silent. The city was preparing for a new day, and that day would be a day of justice for Sherlock Holmes. By morning, Holmes was already ready. There were no signs of fatigue on his face. On the contrary, there was a sharp gleam in his eyes. The excitement of the big day had energized him. When Watson came downstairs, he found Holmes having breakfast at the table. This was a rare sight. Holmes usually forgot to eat when working on a case. "Good morning, Watson," said Holmes in a cheerful voice. "Today will be a fine day." Watson was surprised by his friend's attitude. "Did you sleep well?" "Not at all, but it doesn't matter. When the mind is focused on the right target, it doesn't need sleep." At 10 o'clock, Lestrade arrived. The inspector listened carefully to Holmes's plan. "Risky," said Lestrade, frowning. "What if the man doesn't confess?" "He will," said Holmes confidently. "Or at least, he'll do something that gives him away. People can't control their reflexes when they're cornered." "What if he tries to escape?" "You and your men will be outside. Lock the back door." Lestrade nodded. "All right, Holmes. I trust you, but be careful." At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Holmes sent a message to the tram depot. The message stated that Ryan Marsh was invited to Baker Street for technical consultation regarding the depot's electrical system. It was a formal invitation, bearing the seal of Scotland Yard. Ryan's reply came within an hour. He accepted. He would be at 221B Baker Street at 5 in the evening. Holmes smiled when he read the message. "He took the bait, Watson." Watson looked uneasy. "I hope we're doing the right thing." "We are doing the right thing," said Holmes. "For justice, for Liam Parker, and for the truth." By 5 o'clock, the sitting room at 201B Baker Street was ready. The fire was burning in the fireplace, and the tea set was on the table. Everything looked normal, like a welcoming environment. But Watson knew that behind this image lay a careful plan. Holmes stood by the window, watching the street. Watson sat in the armchair by the fireplace, waiting nervously. Outside, Lestrade and 2 police officers were hiding in a car across the street. At exactly 5 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Mrs. Hudson opened it, and a few seconds later, Ryan Marsh entered the living room. The man was smiling as usual. He was wearing a clean suit, a far cry from his usual warehouse worker appearance. And, of course, he had his usual leather gloves on his hands. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," said Ryan, extending his hand. "Thank you for inviting me. How can I help?" Holmes shook Ryan's hand. It was a firm, confident handshake. But Holmes felt a slight sweat in the man's palm. Ryan was not as relaxed as he appeared. "Sit down, Mr. Marsh," said Holmes, gesturing to the opposite chair. "Tea?" "Thank you gladly." Watson poured the tea and handed it to Ryan. The man took the cup, but did not remove his gloves. Holmes sat down opposite him and studied Ryan carefully. The smile was there, but there was unease in his eyes. The man might have sensed the real purpose of this invitation. "Mr. Marsh," said Holmes in a calm voice, "I want to tell you a story that takes place in a tram depot. A story about theft, murder, and a secret crime." Ryan's smile froze. The cup trembled slightly in his hand. "What do you mean?" said Ryan, his voice a little tense. Holmes did not take his eyes off Ryan's. "I think," he said slowly, "you know very well what I mean, Mr. Marsh. You know very well." And so, the final act was about to begin. Chapter 7. The Final Act. In the sitting room of 221B Baker Street, a deep silence reigned, broken only by the crackling of the fireplace. Ryan Marsh sat in the opposite armchair, a teacup in his hand. The smile on his face had long since faded. Holmes, sitting across from him, watched him intently, his eyes never leaving him, with the patience of a hunter observing its prey. Watson stood by the fireplace, observing the scene. In his pocket was a small whistle he would use to signal Lestrade. Outside, across the street, the inspector and his men were waiting. "Mr. Marsh," Holmes finally said, breaking the silence, "I told you I would tell you a story. Allow me to begin at the beginning." Ryan set his cup down on the table. His hands were clenched inside his gloves. "I'm listening." Holmes stood up and began pacing in front of the fireplace. His voice was calm but sharp, each word carefully measured. "About 2 years ago, a technician working at the Blackfriars tram depot discovered a way to earn some extra income. This man knew the electrical systems well. He was familiar with the depot's internal workings, its inventory system, and its security vulnerabilities." Holmes paused and looked at Ryan. The man was trying to keep his face expressionless, but the anxiety in his eyes was unmistakable. This man began systematically stealing materials from the depot. Copper cables, electric motors, spare parts. He would record them as scrap or defective and then take them out late at night. He would meet a black marketeer named Georgie Tate at an old pier on the Thames and turn the materials into cash. Ryan's face twitched, but he didn't speak. "For 2 years this scheme ran smoothly," Holmes continued. "But then a problem arose. An honest technician named Liam Parker began to notice inconsistencies in the inventory records." Holmes picked up Liam's notebook from the table and showed him the pages. Liam was a meticulous man. He wrote everything down, and in his notes he identified dozens of materials recorded as scrap, but physically missing. More importantly, he realized these discrepancies were linked to a specific person. Holmes opened the notebook and pointed to a specific page. "Look, it says here, RM, morning shifts, always early, board access, check. RM is Ryan Marsh. That's you." Ryan's face had gone pale. His lips were trembling, but he still didn't speak. Liam started watching you, Holmes said. He requested overtime to be in the warehouse during night shifts. But the manager, Victor Harlow, denied the request. Liam didn't give up. Instead, he decided to come to the warehouse early in the morning to observe you, to gather evidence. Holmes continued walking around the desk. And you noticed this. You realized Liam was following you. The man planned to expose everything at the union meeting that weekend. You decided to take action to prevent that. Holmes paused and looked Ryan in the eye. Your murder plan was clever, I must admit. Using the electrical systems, you decided to kill Liam under the guise of an accident. On the night of the incident, you came to the warehouse after midnight. Derek Sully saw you. You said you were doing emergency maintenance, but in reality, you were setting a deadly trap. Holmes pointed to the electrical circuit he had drawn on the board. You connected the metal door handle in the service corridor to a high-voltage cable coming from the main panel. You cut the door handle's grounding wire. You used a fuse in the panel as a switch. When you opened it, current reached the door handle, and when you closed it, everything looked normal. Ryan's hands began to tremble. Inside his gloves, his fingers clenched and unclenched. The next morning at 5:13 a.m., you arrived at the warehouse. The records show this. You set the trap and waited. Liam entered the warehouse at 6:22. He headed for the service corridor as usual to check the inventory. Holmes's voice dropped, almost to a whisper. At 6:35, Liam touched the door handle. High voltage current passed through his body. His heart stopped. He fell backward. Death came suddenly and silently. Watson watched Ryan's face. The man had gone pale. His lips had taken on a bluish tint. Then you moved quickly, Holmes continued. You turned off the power, disconnected the hidden cable. You did all this in a matter of minutes. And then you put your alibi plan into action. Holmes pointed to the clock on the wall. The wall clock. You had set it 4 minutes fast. This small manipulation gave you the buffer time you needed. Everyone thinks the body was found at 6:45, but the real time was 6:41. That 4-minute difference was enough for you to appear in the canteen. Holmes took out the small key he had found in Ryan's bag and placed it on the table. This key was found in your tool bag. The clockmaker confirmed that it is used precisely to adjust the hands of that type of clock. Ryan looked at the key. For a moment, the expression of a trapped animal appeared on his face. But your biggest mistake, said Holmes, was what you said to Tommy Brennan. Immediately after the body was found, before anyone had mentioned death, you said, "Poor Liam, he shouldn't have died like that." You knew about the death before it was officially announced, because you killed him. The room fell into a deep silence. Ryan sat motionless, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. It was as if an invisible weight was crushing him. Holmes sat down opposite Ryan and spoke softly. "Mr. Marsh, I've told you what I know. Now I'm giving you a chance. I want to hear it from your own mouth. What happened that morning?" There was a long silence. Ryan's breathing was uneven. His chest rose and fell. Then slowly, he raised his head. "You," he said, his voice low and trembling. "You know everything." "Yes," said Holmes, "but I want you to say it." Ryan took a deep breath. His eyes turned to the flames in the fireplace. For a moment, he looked very far away. He said finally, "I didn't want Liam to die." Watson held his breath. The confession was beginning. "I just wanted him to shut up," Ryan continued, his voice almost inaudible. "I wanted to scare him. The electric shock. I thought it would knock him out. It would be a warning. A way of saying, keep your nose out of it." Holmes shook his head but didn't interrupt. "But I miscalculated. The voltage, it was too high. Or Liam's heart was weak. I don't know. Ryan's eyes were moist. When he touched the door, I saw him fall. I ran, I checked him. His heart had stopped. He was dead. Ryan covered his face with his hands. Inside his gloves, his fingers trembled. I panicked. I cleaned everything up. I unplugged the cord, turned off the fuse. Then I showed up, in the cafeteria as if nothing had happened. But inside... The man fell silent. His shoulders shook. A silent sob. Holmes glanced at Watson. The doctor nodded. This was a genuine confession. "What about the theft?" Holmes asked, his tone unchanged. "You stole supplies from the warehouse for 2 years." Ryan lifted his head. His eyes were red, tears on his face. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I stole. I needed the money. My mother is sick, nursing home expenses. My salary wasn't enough. At first it was small things. I thought no one would notice. Then more and more. And Liam noticed. Yes, he was walking around with that damn notebook everywhere, taking notes. I knew one day he would catch me. He would tell everything at the union meeting. My life would be over." Ryan placed his gloved hands on his knees. "I'm not a murderer, Mr. Holmes. At least, I didn't want to be. But that night, that decision, it ruined everything." Holmes stood up and leaned against the mantelpiece. There was neither triumph nor pity on his face, just a weary sense of justice. "Mr. Marsh," said Holmes, "there's one more thing I want from you. Take off your gloves." Ryan looked at Holmes. In his eyes there was a last spark of resistance. "Why?" "Because I want to know exactly what it is." A long moment passed. Then Ryan slowly removed his left glove. His hand looked normal, calloused, a worker's hand. Then he began to remove his right glove. When the glove fell, Watson drew a slight breath. On Ryan's right palm and fingers were small but distinct burn marks. Reddish-brown spots, the kind left by a high-voltage cable. "That night," Ryan said, looking at his hands, "while holding the cable, a spark jumped. It hurt, but I didn't think much of it. Then the marks remained. They just wouldn't go away." Holmes turned to Watson. "Doctor, can you confirm these marks?" Watson approached and examined Ryan's hands. With a professional eye, he assessed the marks. "Electrical burns," Watson said with certainty. "The characteristic marks left by high-voltage current at the point of contact, probably formed 2 to 3 weeks ago." Holmes nodded. The final piece had fallen into place. "Mr. Marsh," Holmes said, "Inspector Lestrade and his men are waiting outside. I'll call them in now. My advice to you, surrender without resistance. If you cooperate, it may work in your favor in court." Ryan stared blankly ahead. The battle was over. He knew it. "All right," he said finally, his voice broken. "All right." Watson went to the window and blew the whistle. Within seconds, footsteps could be heard from below. The door opened and Lestrade entered, accompanied by 2 police officers. "Ryan Marsh," said Lestrade in an official tone, "you are under arrest for the murder of Liam Parker and aggravated theft. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." The officers handcuffed Ryan. He didn't resist. He just kept his head bowed, his eyes fixed on the floor. As he walked out the door, Ryan paused for a moment and turned to Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice low. "Liam, he was a good man, better than me. I'm sorry." Holmes looked into the man's eyes. For a moment, the line between killer and victim blurred. Ryan Marsh had once been an ordinary man, someone with dreams, fears, and weaknesses. But one wrong decision had brought him to this point. Regret, Holmes said slowly, does not replace justice, Mr. Marsh. But perhaps it will ease your soul. Ryan nodded and left with the officers. Their footsteps faded on the stairs, the door closed, and the sitting room at 221B Baker Street fell silent. Lestrade came over to Holmes. There was a weary smile on his face. "Good work, Holmes," he said. "As always." Holmes shrugged. "I just put the pieces together, Lestrade. The real heroes are Liam Parker and everyone who searched for him." Lestrade nodded and left. When the door closed behind him, only Holmes and Watson remained in the room. Watson sank into the chair by the fireplace. He took a long breath. "It's over," he said. "Finally over." Holmes walked to the window and looked out. On the street, Lestrade's car was driving away. Ryan Marsh was inside, heading toward the next part of his life. Court, punishment, perhaps years in prison. "Yes," said Holmes, his voice thoughtful. "It's over." Watson studied his friend's face. In Holmes's eyes there was something beyond triumph. Fatigue, perhaps, or sadness. It was hard to tell. "What are you thinking, Holmes?" Holmes turned and looked at Watson. He smiled slightly. "I'm thinking, Watson, that justice is a complex concept. Ryan Marsh is a murderer, but he is also a son caring for his sick mother. Liam Parker is a victim, but he is also a brave man trying to uncover the truth." Holmes walked to the fireplace and stared into the flames. People are not one-dimensional. There is light and darkness within all of us. The difference is which one we allow to shine. Watson nodded. "Liam's family, what will happen to them?" "Lestrade will inform them. They will learn that Liam's death was not an accident, that the killer has been caught. It won't ease their pain, but perhaps it will bring them some peace." Holmes took his pipe from the mantelpiece and lit it. As the smoke rose toward the ceiling, the atmosphere in the room changed. Tension gave way to calm. "And that old clock," said Watson, smiling slightly. "The clock that was 4 minutes fast. In the end, it was the key to the case." Holmes nodded. "Yes, sometimes the smallest details reveal the greatest truths. 4 minutes on a clock changed one man's life and another man's freedom." Outside, the London evening was falling. The street lamps had begun to light up, and the sky had turned deep blue. Fog, as always, was slowly enveloping the streets. Holmes looked out the window at the city. London stood there with all its complexity, all its mysteries, and all its stories. Every street held a secret, every window a life, every shadow a truth. "Watson," said Holmes without taking his eyes off the city. "I love this city because it is never silent. There is always a puzzle, always a challenge." Watson stood up and came over to his friend. "And you, Holmes, were made to solve these puzzles." Holmes smiled slightly. "Perhaps, or perhaps the puzzles exist to solve me." The two of them gazed silently out of the window for a while. London stretched out before them, boundless, mysterious, and as captivating as ever. After a while, Mrs. Hudson knocked on the door and entered. "Gentlemen," she said with her usual warm smile, "dinner is ready. It's waiting downstairs." Watson turned to Holmes. "Dinner? A real dinner at a table?" Holmes laughed. "Why not? It was a good day today. Justice was served. We deserve a roast and some wine to celebrate." The two followed Mrs. Hudson downstairs. On the stairs, their footsteps echoed on the wood. 221B Baker Street looked warm and inviting as always. And somewhere in the quiet corridors of the tram depot, Liam Parker's spirit had perhaps finally found peace. Because the truth had come out. Because justice had been served. And because Sherlock Holmes, as always, had found the light in the darkness. The end